So thank you very much, Nigel, for the introduction. I hope that everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Great. So I've only prepared a couple of pages of remarks that I'd like to remake on the topic that I've been asked to speak about tonight or this evening, at least in this part of the world. And that topic is contemporary relevance of Pan Africanism. Now, it's important for me to mention that I've been asked to lecture on 4 different topics in the class dealing with the origins of Pan Africanism, which date back to antiquity up through the early 20th century. I'll also give lectures on the intellectual history of Pan-African thought, as well as the political philosophies of people like Marcus Garvey and others who advocated for the politics of self-determination. So I'll start by saying that according to our ancestor, the Africologist and Pan-African scholar activist, as well as the founding editor of the award-winning journal titled Africology, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, Dr. Itabari Mzulu, Pan-Africanism can be defined as follows, quote, a theory and political ideology concerning the unity of African people around the world, an international socialist and anti-imperialist ideology that recognizes the unity of African people everywhere, unquote. While some Afrocentric and African-centered scholars have identified the ancient origins of Pan-Africanism in classical African civilizations, in addition to indigenous racial consciousness in Africa, and here I'm thinking about people like Obadele Kambon, as well as scholars like Nantambu, most notably in Kemet, or what many people recognize as ancient Egypt. Some other scholars have also identified that contemporary Pan-Africanism is actually a product of the African diaspora and is directly linked to the articulation of what the Senegalese scholar Mamadou Diouf refers to as a more inclusive understanding of universal narratives of the human past and experience, unquote. His thoughts have also been echoed by the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. The vast African continent alone is home to a population that is fast exceeding 1 billion and rolling towards 2 billion in the nearest futures. Efforts to unify African people in Africa, as well as those in the African world community outside of the African continent, is the most significant project in the contemporary moment for African people. Given the current discourse on global Africa or global African phenomenon that has been articulated by people like Hilary McBeckles and our ancestor Renuko Rashidi, among others, that is taking place inside and outside of the geographical borders of the African continent. At the outset, it is important for us to understand what our ancestor, the historian Colin A. Palmer, referred to as the, quote, 5 major African diasporic streams that occurred at different times and for different reasons. And I won't quote him directly here, but I will mention that Colin Palmer helps us understand that African people have been migrating within and outside of the African continent for at least 100,000 years. And there have been other diasporic streams from about 3,000 years before the Common Era that is associated with the Bantu peoples moving from what is now roughly considered Nigeria and Cameroon to other parts of the continent, as well as regions bordering the Indian Ocean. Of course, many of us are familiar with the trading diasporas associated with merchants, soldiers, and enslaved peoples as a part of the trade that emerged between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia around the 5th century BCE. Palmer also mentions a fourth major African diasporic stream that we usually associated with the Atlantic trade and enslaved Africans. And of course, his fifth stream refers to the migrations that emerged after the 19th century's demise of slavery in the Americas. And that same migration or diaspora continues into our own times. I think it's important that we note that when we speak of global Africa and global African phenomenon, or when we speak of the African diaspora, and especially Pan Africanism, we are making reference to Black African people in the world community on a planetary scale. This encompasses Black African people inside and outside of the African continent. For me, as a Pan-Africanist, I decided to come home because I wanted to be a part of the rebuilding of continental Black African civilizations by directly contributing to the work of higher education in Africa. My research, teaching, and writings on African nationalism and Pan-Africanism provide a foundation for my activism as a scholar. And I note that I consider teaching and writing to be among the most viable nonviolent means of, number one, social protest against and the ending of injustice, and number two, the achievement of sustainable development. One of the original architects of the Afrocentric methodological approach, the Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah, articulated a Pan-African approach to educational development as early as October 25th, 1963, in a speech titled The African Genius that he delivered at the opening of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. These kinds of epistemic approaches would open space for a deeper engagement of Black African-centered activists who were based in the African diaspora, as well as Pan-Africanists who repatriated to or were based on the African continent, as well as future African-centered scholars and Pan-Africanists who repatriated to the continent. Nigel mentioned my first academic book, which is titled Travel in the Pan-African Imagination. In that book, I focused on the repatriation movement during the 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as on the discipline of what has now become Africology, via an analysis of the first academic book with Africology as a central focus. That book is titled Africology by a scholar whom we don't know much about, who simply went by the name E. Uzong. Given that intellectual engagement is a critical part of Africology, I am currently working on a new book project that seeks new ways of understanding the contemporary relationship of repatriation and African-centered and Pan-Africanist scholarship. Now, some of you may be wondering, what is Africology? According to the Ugandan scholar, Danny Wadada Nabudere, who's now one of our ancestors, quote, Africology is an epistemology of knowledge generation and application that has its roots in African cosmology and worldviews. It is a universal epistemology, precisely because it recognizes that knowledge is created by different languages. Africology is therefore universal because it can help us integrate human knowledge. It seeks to retrace the evolution of knowledge and wisdom from its source in the cradle of humankind in Africa up to the current scientific epistemologies and to try to situate them in their historical and cultural contexts. I also think it's important to mention that according to Kwame Nkrumah, there exists what he calls the need for a reinterpretation and a new assessment of the factors that make up our past. He argues that we must recognize frankly that African studies, and here we can even say Pan-African studies, in the form in which they have been developed in the universities and centers of learning, especially in the Western world, have been largely influenced by the concepts of old-style colonial studies, and still to some extent, remain under the shadow of colonial ideologies and mentalities. Indeed, it was Nkrumah who urged us to, quote, study the history, cultures, and institutions, languages, and arts of Africa in new African-centered ways. These are his words. In entire freedom from the propositions and presuppositions of the colonial epoch, and from the distortions of those professors and lecturers who continue to make European studies of Africa the basis of this new assessment. Just recently, scholars like Mjiba Frehu, who's also an African repatriate and Pan-Africanist activist who works in Ghana, she and her team, in a paper on Nkrumah's impact on the emergence of Pan-African consciousness in the USA, made a very prescient observation by reminding us that during the 19th and early 20th centuries, quote, Africa was key to many Pan-Africanist promotions of Pan-Africanism. Most did not make the journey back home due to the political, economic, and social conditions of the period, but they all longed for the day that Africa would be the epicenter of Pan-African activity. Kwame Nkrumah's homecoming after several years abroad marked the beginning of Pan-Africanism's return to Africa, unquote. In conclusion, as a direct result of the impact of Nkrumah, African studies instructions and Pan-Africanism remains a compulsory part of tertiary education in Ghana. And this is just one example of the contemporary relevance of Pan-Africanism. Of course, there are other examples. For me, the opportunity to teach Africa-centered knowledge to continental African youth facilitates the achievements of one of the main goals of centering what the linguist Obadele Kambon refers to as studies of Black people, or in the Metu Neter, or what some people call hieroglyphics, Sebiyat Nut Kimatu, integrating African studies into the thinking and actions of students and future agents of social change, especially on the African continent, and indeed throughout the African world community. Thank you very much.